Imagine stepping into the glittering halls of a royal palace in 16th century Europe. Golden chandeliers shimmer overhead, velvet gowns sweep across the marble floors, and the air smells of... Wait, is that urine and rotting teeth? Behind the elegant portraits and royal titles lay a world that would make most modern people gag. For centuries, queens, princesses, and noblewomen were admired for their grace, but their hygiene habits were anything but graceful. From rarely bathing to using lead makeup that slowly poisoned their faces, these royal women lived in an environment that looked luxurious but smelled like a compost heap wrapped in silk. Let's peel back the perfume-soaked layers of royal history and uncover the disgusting hygiene secrets of Europe's most powerful women. The royal bath that never happened. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, bathing was not just uncommon, it was often seen as dangerous. Many royals believed that water could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body. So instead of regular baths, most noblewomen would go months or even years without a full body wash. Take Queen Elizabeth I of England, 1533 to 1603. Known as the Virgin Queen, she ruled during the Golden Age of England. But behind the throne, she reportedly took a full bath only once a month, whether she needed it or not. For the rest of the time, her ladies-in-waiting would wipe her body with linen cloths soaked in rose water. Imagine the layers of sweat, perfume, and makeup building up under her stiff gowns and corsets. In France, things were even more theatrical. At the court of Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, Versailles became the center of elegance and etiquette. But despite its magnificent gardens and fountains, the palace itself had no proper bathrooms. Royal women wore gigantic dresses, sometimes weighing over 30 pounds, that made it nearly impossible to undress easily. Baths were rare, and when they happened, they were more like rituals than actual cleaning. A wooden tub would be placed in a private chamber. Servants would heat buckets of water and pour them in. Perfumed oils and herbs were added to mask the stench, not remove it. Bathing could take hours, and afterward, the tub water was often reused by others in the household, including servants. Many women believed that too much bathing could weaken their bodies. Doctors warned them that moisture invites death. As a result, hygiene relied heavily on linen shifts, which they changed daily. The linen would soak up sweat and dirt, acting as a kind of wearable sponge. But changing clothes isn't the same as washing your skin. The result was layers upon layers of rancid buildup, hidden beneath pearls and brocade. And the smell? Contemporary visitors often described European courts as pungent, overpowering, or undescribable. One ambassador from the Ottoman Empire even remarked that the French royals smelled worse than their horses.
Perfume, poison, and deadly beauty rituals. Since real cleanliness was rare, perfume became a weapon. Royal women didn't bathe away odors, they simply covered them up. At the French court in the 17th and 18th centuries, perfume was considered a sign of wealth and power. Noblewomen carried scented handkerchiefs, perfumed fans, and even apple-shaped pomanders filled with herbs to hold under their noses. But perfumes were strong. Musk, ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines, and civet, from the glands of civet cats, were common ingredients. The result was a head-spinning cocktail of sweat and musk, especially in crowded ballrooms. Makeup was another disaster. Royal women often used white lead powder to achieve the pale porcelain look that was fashionable across Europe. But this makeup was toxic. It slowly ate away at their skin, causing scars, sores, and hair loss. Instead of stopping, they would apply more powder to cover the damage, creating a cycle of decay hidden under layers of deadly beauty. Rouge made from cinnabar, a mercury compound, was applied to cheeks. Belladonna, a poisonous plant, was sometimes dripped into the eyes to dilate pupils, creating a seductive look while damaging vision. Wigs added to the nightmare. Massive powdered wigs became the fashion in France during the late 17th century. Underneath these towering hairpieces, real hair was often unclean and crawling with lice. Women used bone combs to scrape through infestations, and wigs were sometimes stored overnight on stands sprinkled with flour, which also attracted mice. Marie Antoinette and her contemporaries popularized elaborate wig decorations, miniature ships, gardens, or entire scenes perched on top of their heads. But beneath the artistry, the smell of sweat, powder, and decay was overwhelming. One English traveler described entering a royal salon in Versailles as like walking into a bakery where something had died. Toilets, teeth, and the royal stink. Perhaps the most shocking part of royal hygiene wasn't the lack of baths, it was what they did instead. Versailles had no proper toilets for much of its early history. Courtiers relieved themselves in chamber pots or behind curtains, and servants would empty the pots into palace courtyards. Sometimes people simply used the corridors. The royal women, wrapped in their gowns, would discreetly use bourdaloues, small boat-shaped chamber pots they could slide between their legs while standing. These were often emptied only after events, meaning ballrooms could smell interesting. Tooth care was equally grim. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist for most of this period. Noble women would rub their teeth with linen cloths and powders made of crushed shells, herbs, or even charcoal. These methods sometimes eroded enamel rather than cleaning. Bad breath was common, so chewing cloves or holding scented herbs in the mouth was a typical trick. Rotten teeth were so widespread that blackened or missing teeth were considered a mark of aristocracy, a sign you could afford sugar, which was expensive. Some queens even blackened their remaining teeth on purpose to fit in with court fashion. And menstrual hygiene? There were no modern pads or tampons. Royal women typically used rags or folded linen. Because underwear wasn't commonly worn, many simply allowed blood to flow freely under their gowns, occasionally changing the linens. Court records mention carpets and chairs being spoiled during royal events, a delicate way of describing menstruation accidents at balls and dinners.
Conclusion: behind the silk curtain. When we look at royal portraits, we see elegance, power, and beauty. But behind those portraits lay a reality that would make any modern person cover their nose and run for the nearest shower. The castles and palaces were dazzling, but they were also stinking, unwashed, lice-ridden, and dangerous places. Hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was misunderstood. And yet, these women shaped history. They negotiated politics, led empires, influenced fashion, all while wearing layers of unwashed linen and poisonous makeup. It's a reminder that history's glamour often hides a surprisingly filthy truth.
Royal bedrooms behind the perfume and powder. Royal bedrooms were supposed to be places of luxury. Thick velvet curtains, feather-stuffed mattresses, and gilded furniture gave the impression of comfort and elegance. But beneath that surface lay a world of stench, insects, and neglect that would horrify any modern visitor. Royal beds were rarely changed. Washing sheets was a laborious process in the 16th and 17th centuries, requiring hours of scrubbing and drying. Most royal women changed their bed linens only once every few weeks, sometimes even less. Over time, layers of sweat, perfume, and powder built up in the fabric. Servants sometimes sprinkled the sheets with dried herbs or flower petals to mask the smell, but the odor never truly left. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers and seldom cleaned. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in the warm folds. Women often wore linen nightgowns to protect themselves from infestations, but this offered little defense. A French visitor to the English court in the late 1500s described royal beds as soft tombs filled with life unseen. In addition to pests, the lack of nighttime bathing routines worsened conditions. Royal women went to bed wearing makeup, perfume, and elaborate wigs. Powder and lead makeup rubbed off on pillows, staining the linens. Wigs, often removed and placed beside the bed, carried lice that crawled onto the mattresses. The air in these bedrooms was thick. Windows were kept closed for fear of night air carrying disease. Fires burned for warmth, but released smoke and soot. Combined with unwashed bodies, the atmosphere became heavy and foul. Royal bedrooms may have looked like paradise in portraits, but in reality they smelled like a mixture of sweat, soot, and rotting fabric. Sleeping in such conditions every night was part of the royal routine. Servants, secrets, and the hidden labor of hygiene. The dirty reality of royal hygiene was carefully managed and hidden by armies of servants. Every royal woman had attendants responsible for dressing, undressing, changing linens, preparing perfumes, and emptying chamber pots. These attendants lived closest to the royal body's filth, but their work ensured that the public saw only elegance. In France, noblewomen at Versailles were attended by ladies-in-waiting, who helped apply makeup and arrange wigs. They wiped the queen's body with perfumed cloths, changed her linen shifts, and powdered her skin. These women were sworn to discretion. The queen's morning toilette was a semi-public ritual, with nobles allowed to watch her dress, but the dirtiest tasks happened in private. Servants prepared the bathing water, carried the chamber pots, and disposed of waste in palace courtyards or rivers. In winter, water froze, and washing became even rarer. The smell inside the servants' corridors was said to be unbearable, as chamber pots overflowed and damp linen piled up. Despite their labor, the servants themselves lived in crowded quarters with little hygiene. Their own unwashed clothes, combined with the royal waste they handled, created a circle of filth within the palace. The royal women depended on them completely. Without their quiet work, the image of royal cleanliness would have collapsed instantly. These attendants also spread trends. If a queen adopted a new scent or makeup style, her attendants copied it, spreading both fashion and disease through the palace. Epidemics of lice or skin infections often started in the servants' rooms and climbed up to the royal chambers. The polished image of queens and princesses was built on hidden, exhausting labor, a system designed to keep the filth invisible, not remove it.
Beliefs, superstitions, and the fear of cleanliness. The most striking part of royal hygiene habits was that they weren't simply the result of laziness. They were rooted in deep cultural beliefs and medical theories. During the medieval and early modern periods, European medicine revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Maintaining health meant keeping these humors in balance. Bathing, doctors warned, could disturb this balance by opening pores and allowing bad air or disease to enter the body. For royal women, whose health was considered politically important, this warning was taken seriously. Another superstition was the fear of night air. People believed that diseases floated through the air after sunset, so windows were kept tightly shut. Ventilation was seen as dangerous, and fresh air was avoided. This trapped smells and humidity inside royal rooms, making conditions worse. Religious beliefs also played a role. In some Christian traditions, excessive bathing was associated with vanity and sin. Royal women were expected to be modest and restrained. While perfume and makeup were socially acceptable for the elite, frequent bathing could be seen as a suspicious indulgence. Water itself was sometimes distrusted. In many regions, rivers were polluted with waste. Public bathhouses, once common during the Roman Empire, had declined and were associated with disease or immorality. By the time of the Renaissance, bathing had become rare across all classes, but among royals, it was replaced by ritualized wiping and scenting, not actual cleanliness. These cultural attitudes lasted for centuries. Even in the 18th century, when Enlightenment ideas were spreading, some queens still bathed rarely and relied on perfume to maintain their image. Hygiene was not a private act of health. It was a public performance of status, shaped by fear, fashion, and faith.
Cosmetics, lead, and the illusion of purity. For royal women, personal hygiene was not defined by how clean the body was. It was defined by how clean the body appeared. Across medieval and early modern Europe, noble women spent far more time painting, powdering, and scenting their skin than washing it. These practices were meant to display status and purity, but in reality, they often made hygiene worse. One of the most infamous substances used by royal women was white lead makeup, also known as Venetian ceruse. This thick, chalky paste was applied to the face to create a pale, porcelain look that symbolized nobility. Pale skin meant that a woman did not work outdoors. It was a visible sign of wealth and rank. But ceruse was made from lead carbonate, a toxic substance that slowly poisoned the skin and bloodstream. Women applied layer after layer of this paste, often without washing the face for weeks. When cracks appeared, they would patch them with more paste rather than clean it off. Over time, the mixture combined with sweat, dirt, and perfume to form a grimy, stiff mask. Underneath, skin infections, sores, and blackened teeth were common. Yet the surface still looked flawless in candlelight. Rouge made from crushed cochineal insects, or cinnabar, a mercury compound, was added to the cheeks. Lips were tinted with vermilion. Eyebrows were darkened with soot or burned cloves. Each substance added its own layer of filth and chemical danger. Because actual washing was rare, these layers accumulated day after day. At night, royal women often slept with their makeup on, as removing it was a time-consuming process involving oil and cloth. This meant that cosmetics rubbed off on pillows, mingled with sweat, and created the perfect environment for bacteria and parasites. Some historians have described royal pillows from the Tudor and Bourbon courts as objects that smelled of perfume, mildew, and metal. Perfume was another key tool of illusion. Scents made from rosewater, ambergris, musk, or herbs were applied to clothes, wigs, and bodies to cover the smell of sweat and unwashed linen. In France, Queen Marie Antoinette was known for wearing layers of perfume to disguise the odor of Versailles, a palace famous for its filthy corridors and overflowing chamber pots. The combination of perfume and cosmetics created a carefully curated image. From a distance, under candlelight, a royal woman looked ethereal, glowing white skin, rosy cheeks, a cloud of floral scent. Up close, the picture was very different. Observers sometimes wrote about the heavy scent that announces their arrival and the cracked surface of faces when they smile. This beauty routine was more than personal vanity. It was a political performance. Royal women represented dynasties. Their bodies were symbols of purity, power, and control. To admit the reality, the sores under the makeup, the lice under the wigs, the odor behind the perfume, would be to expose the fragility of royal power itself. Medical understanding at the time also reinforced these habits. Physicians believed that cosmetics could protect the skin from miasmas, or bad air, which they thought caused disease. A thick layer of lead paste was seen not only as fashionable, but also as protective, sealing the pores from dangerous winds. Ironically, this protection trapped sweat and bacteria, causing more harm than good. By the 17th and 18th centuries, entire industries revolved around supplying royal courts with these products. Alchemists prepared secret cosmetic formulas. Perfumers became wealthy and famous. Young noblewomen learned the arts of painting their faces from older ladies-in-waiting. Hygiene became less about cleanliness and more about maintaining the mask, a literal and metaphorical disguise. Behind this dazzling facade lay a simple truth. The royal body, beneath its layers of powder and perfume, was often as unwashed and unhealthy as that of the poorest peasant. The only difference was how well the illusion was maintained.
Toileting rituals, chamber pots, courtyards, and public performance. If one subject reveals the gap between royal elegance and real hygiene most clearly, it is the way royal women used the toilet. Modern bathrooms did not exist in European palaces for most of history. Instead, royal women relied on chamber pots, commodes, and hidden corners, and their toileting habits were often both unsanitary and surprisingly public. Chamber pots in the palace. In medieval and Renaissance courts, a royal woman's chamber pot was often a luxury object. Made of pewter, porcelain, or silver, these pots were kept under beds, inside closets, or behind screens. Servants emptied them into palace courtyards, gardens, or nearby rivers. The problem was not the pots themselves, but the lack of plumbing. Waste piled up quickly, especially in large courts with dozens of residents. At Versailles, for example, thousands of nobles lived in the palace, but toilets were scarce and often broken. Servants and courtiers frequently relieved themselves in stairwells, hallways, and fireplaces. Even royal women sometimes used corners of rooms or behind curtains when no attendants were nearby. Contemporary visitors wrote of the unbearable smell in the corridors and the disgusting puddles near the doors of noble chambers. The public toilet ritual. For queens and princesses, toileting could be a semi-public ritual just like dressing. In France, the queen's toilette sometimes included the presence of ladies-in-waiting, physicians, and even high-ranking courtiers. Watching a queen wash her hands, wipe with linen, or use a commode was considered a privilege, a way of demonstrating loyalty and closeness to power. This ritual might seem humiliating, but in royal culture, the queen's body was a public institution. Her fertility, health, and appearance symbolized the state itself. Every aspect of her routine, even toileting, became ceremonial. Servants brought warmed cloths, perfumed water, and sometimes rose petals to mask the smell. But the reality was unavoidably dirty. There were no flush toilets, no regular sanitation systems, and the palace air often carried the stench. Linen instead of paper. Toilet paper did not exist in Europe during much of this period. Royal women used linen cloths that were washed and reused. Some courts used soft moss, wool, or even handfuls of straw in emergencies. The cloths were kept in baskets near the commode. Servants were responsible for collecting, washing, and returning them, a job that exposed them daily to disease and filth. The use of perfumed linen was common. A lady might wipe herself with a perfumed cloth, not primarily to clean, but to leave a pleasant smell. In some courts, perfumed gloves or sachets were also kept nearby to mask any lingering odors on the hands. Hand washing was minimal, often involving only a quick rinse in rose water, not soap and water. Waste disposal and disease. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of royal toileting was how the waste was disposed of. In many European palaces, chamber pots were simply dumped out of windows into courtyards or moats. The stench lingered constantly, especially in summer. Versailles was notorious for its foul air. Visitors compared it to open sewers. This unsanitary environment contributed to frequent outbreaks of disease, including dysentery and typhoid. Doctors of the time did not fully understand germ theory, so they often blamed miasmas or bad air rather than the actual source, human waste. Royal women, despite their status, lived amid this contamination daily. Symbolism over cleanliness. It is important to understand that toileting for royal women was less about personal comfort and more about maintaining social hierarchy. A queen never emptied her own chamber pot. That was the job of trusted attendants. Being allowed to hold the pot or assist was considered an honor. This bizarre inversion, treating the dirtiest tasks as privileges, reflected how power functioned in royal courts. Even when rudimentary water closets began appearing in the 18th century, they were rare and often unreliable. Many royal women preferred their familiar commodes and chamber pots, surrounded by perfumed cloths and loyal attendants. Cleanliness was never the goal. Appearances, rituals, and hierarchy were. The palace as a latrine. By the end of the 17th century, many European palaces were effectively giant, perfumed latrines. Marble halls and gilded ceilings hid the reality of waste-stained floors, overfilled pits, and foul air. Foreign visitors often remarked that, despite the riches, the smell was overpowering. One ambassador to Versailles noted, "The eyes are dazzled, but the nose is assaulted." For royal women, navigating this environment meant constant exposure to unsanitary conditions. Their chamber pots might have been made of silver, but the experience was no cleaner than that of peasants, sometimes worse, because the sheer number of people in palaces multiplied the filth.
Palaces of perfume and stench, when luxury couldn't hide the smell. European palaces were built to impress the eyes, not the nose. Their grand facades, gold-leafed interiors, mirrored halls, and marble staircases dazzled visitors. But for anyone who lived inside, the daily experience of smell told a very different story. Royal women, surrounded by attendants, fabrics, cosmetics, perfumes, and waste, spent their lives in buildings where stench was as constant as luxury. The architecture of odor. Medieval and early modern palaces lacked the plumbing and ventilation that modern people take for granted. Thick stone walls trapped heat and moisture. Windows were small and usually kept closed because of the widespread belief that night air carried disease. Fires burned in almost every room, filling the air with smoke and soot. Against this backdrop, thousands of people lived, ate, sweated, and relieved themselves. Royal courts were crowded. Nobles, servants, soldiers, priests, diplomats, and workers shared the same spaces. Waste from chamber pots was dumped in courtyards. Kitchens produced mountains of scraps and grease. Latrines, where they existed, overflowed. For royal women, their chambers were theoretically the cleanest places in the palace, yet they too were subject to these architectural limits. Heavy draperies, wool carpets, and upholstered furniture absorbed smells. Without regular washing, fabrics became repositories of years of odor, trapping sweat, smoke, and perfume. Even when their bed sheets were sprinkled with herbs, the background stench lingered. The perfume arms race. To fight this reality, royal women engaged in what some historians call a perfume arms race. From the 16th to 18th centuries, perfume became not just a luxury, but a survival tool. Queens, princesses, and noble ladies layered multiple scents, rose, jasmine, ambergris, musk, to cover the ambient smells of rot and waste. Perfumed gloves were fashionable in Italy and France. Royal women wore sachets of dried flowers or herbs in their skirts. Wigs were dusted with scented powders. Some carried small pomanders,
metal spheres filled with spices or perfumes to hold to their noses while walking through foul-smelling corridors. However, the more perfume they used, the heavier and more artificial the air became. Visitors often described the combination of perfume and filth as suffocating. In the 17th century, English travelers to the French court remarked that the palace smelled like a rose garden built atop a sewer. Such remarks circulated among European courts, shaping how rulers were perceived abroad. Royal women, as the most visible symbols of refinement, had to work the hardest to counter this reality. Their personal perfume choices, the rituals of their morning toilettes, and the fabrics they wore all contributed to maintaining the illusion of a pure environment. Yet even their efforts could not fully mask the stench of palace life. The smell of power. Despite the filth, these palaces were symbols of power. The ability to live in such spaces, to control servants who managed waste, and to surround oneself with luxurious scents became part of what it meant to be royal. In some ways, the stench itself was a marker of hierarchy. Only the powerful could afford to live in places where others cleaned up after them. Royal women navigated this world with grace, ritual, and layers of fragrance. But beneath the surface, they lived amid constant odors that would horrify modern sensibilities. Their lives were spent in buildings that smelled of sweat, smoke, roses, and rot, a sensory mixture that perfectly embodied the contradictions of royal life, dazzling beauty built atop hidden decay.
Layers of filth, clothing, underwear, and the royal body. Royal clothing dazzled the eye, shimmering silks, intricate embroidery, gemstones, lace, and gold thread. In paintings, queens and princesses appear flawless, wrapped in elegance. But beneath these luxurious layers lay a very different reality. Royal women's clothing habits reflected a world where washing was rare, layers were heavy, and sweat, dirt, and lice thrived unseen. Multiple layers, little washing. European royal women typically wore 4 to 6 layers of clothing each day. A linen shift or camise went closest to the skin, followed by corsets, underskirts, gowns, and elaborate outer garments. The camise was theoretically meant to absorb sweat and protect outer garments from dirt. However, even this inner layer was not changed daily. Washing clothes was expensive and time-consuming. Linen camises might be changed once a week, outer garments even less frequently. Some heavy dresses were never fully washed at all during their lifespan. Instead, they were aired out, brushed, or sprinkled with perfume and herbs to mask odors. During hot months, the layers trapped sweat and heat. Under the corsets and gowns, skin often became irritated, developing rashes and sores. Because bathing was rare, sweat and oils accumulated on the skin, soaking into the linen. Over weeks, this created a permanent sour smell that perfumes could only partially cover. Corsets and confinement. Corsets, essential to royal fashion, contributed to hygiene problems. Worn tightly for hours each day, they restricted airflow to the skin. Dirt and sweat collected beneath the stiff stays, which were rarely cleaned. In some cases, women developed skin infections or fungal growth under their corsets. Removing and cleaning corsets required time and privacy, luxuries not always available in crowded royal households. Many women simply wiped themselves with scented cloths and put the same corsets back on day after day. Over months, the buildup of grime became substantial. The mystery of underwear. Contrary to modern expectations, most royal women in Europe did not wear underwear, as in modern briefs, until the late 18th or early 19th century. Open-crotch linen shifts were common. This allowed women to use chamber pots without removing layers of clothing, but also meant that sweat, bodily fluids, and odors were in constant contact with their gowns and seats.
When menstruation occurred, women used folded linen cloths held in place by belts or strings. These were washed and reused. The process was messy and, without modern sanitation, often unhygienic. Servants were responsible for cleaning these linens, exposing them to royal waste daily. Perfume versus reality. To mask the inevitable smells, royal women relied on perfumed satchels, dried herbs and scented oils. Small cloth bags filled with lavender, rosemary, or rose petals were tucked into sleeves and skirts. Gowns might be lightly perfumed with orange blossom water before formal events. But perfume could not stop the spread of lice and other parasites. Heavy wigs and ornate hairstyles, combined with unwashed clothing, created ideal environments for insects. Royal women often scratched discreetly during court ceremonies, and knit combs were used regularly behind the scenes. In some courts, entire teams of attendants were assigned to maintain clothing and wigs, yet their work focused on appearances, not true cleanliness. Dresses were repaired and restarched, not laundered. Wigs were powdered and perfumed, not washed. The smell beneath the splendor. Visitors to royal courts sometimes remarked on the contrast between sight and smell. A queen might enter a hall glittering with jewels, trailing perfume, but those standing nearby could detect the musty, sour odor beneath the fabric. Layers of clothing, weeks of sweat, and the absence of regular washing created a scent that no amount of rose water could erase. Worse, clothing often absorbed the smells of the palace itself: smoke, waste, kitchen grease, and dampness. Heavy brocade and velvet retained these odors for months. Dressing rooms sometimes smelled like a mix of perfume and mildew. Symbolism over comfort. Why endure such discomfort? Clothing was not just personal attire, it was a political statement. The more elaborate and impractical a gown, the more it displayed the wearer's wealth and power. Royal women wore these outfits for hours, even during hot summers, because appearing regal mattered more than feeling clean. Fashion dictated behavior. Women could not simply remove layers to cool off or clean up. This would undermine the image of controlled elegance. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, played almost no role. Status outweighed hygiene. Hidden labor behind the scenes. Maintaining these garments required armies of laundresses, seamstresses, and dressers. Linen was boiled and beaten in cold rivers. Gowns were brushed and hung. Perfumes were reapplied. Yet this enormous labor system focused on preserving appearances, not promoting health. Royal women relied on it entirely, but they themselves often spent days without changing their most intimate garments. Royal women's clothing reflected the fundamental contradiction of their lives: dazzling luxury on the outside, discomfort and filth beneath. Layers of silk and lace could impress a court, but they also trapped sweat, smells, and insects. For all their power, queens and princesses lived in bodies encased not in comfort, but in beautiful cages of dirt and perfume.
Disease, decay, and the hidden cost of royal beauty. Royal women were symbols of perfection, painted, perfumed, and poised. But beneath their powdered faces and jeweled smiles lay a host of diseases and hygiene-related health problems that would shock modern audiences. The absence of proper bathing, dental care, and medical understanding left even queens vulnerable to decay and disfigurement. Lead makeup and skin damage. One of the most devastating culprits was white lead makeup, or Venetian ceruse. As described earlier, this thick paste created the pale, flawless look associated with nobility. But over time, it poisoned the skin. Prolonged use caused piffing, sores, and permanent scarring. Some royal women's faces became so damaged that they needed thicker layers of makeup just to cover the wounds, creating a vicious cycle.
Queen Elizabeth I of England is one of the most famous examples. By the end of her life, she was known to wear inch-thick layers of white paste to hide scars and lesions, believed to be caused by years of lead use. Her attendants noted that removing her makeup took hours, and the stench from the mixture was overwhelming. Lead poisoning also affected the body internally. Headaches, hair loss, blackened teeth, and even organ damage. But because these symptoms were poorly understood, they were often attributed to bad air or moral weakness, not cosmetics. Skin infections and parasites. Rare bathing and constant use of heavy clothing created perfect conditions for skin infections, lice, and parasites. Royal women often suffered from rashes, fungal growth, and itching under their corsets and wigs. Knit combs were a regular part of royal dressing tables. Some tried to combat these problems with scented waters, vinegar rubs, or herbal poultices. But without real soap or sterilization, these methods offered little relief. In many palaces, outbreaks of lice and scabies spread quickly among the court. Servants, sharing cramped quarters and handling unwashed linens, passed infestations back and forth between classes. Dental neglect and bad breath. Perhaps the least glamorous aspect of royal hygiene was dental care. Toothbrushes existed in some form by the 17th century, but their use was rare and inconsistent. Most royal women used cloths dipped in vinegar or wine, sometimes rubbed with crushed herbs to wipe their teeth. Sugar, introduced into European courts through trade, became a status symbol, and with it came widespread tooth decay. Blackened or missing teeth were common among noble women, particularly in England and France. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously suffered from severe dental issues. Foreign visitors remarked on her foul breath, which attendants tried to mask with scented handkerchiefs. Some women applied white powders or even thin sheets of porcelain to their teeth for appearances, but these were temporary measures. Tooth extraction was painful, performed without anesthesia, and often left infections. Abscesses, jaw problems, and chronic pain were frequent companions of royal beauty. The smell of sickness. Because regular washing was rare, diseases often announced themselves through smell before symptoms were fully understood. Skin infections, rotting teeth, and festering sores emitted odors that perfumes struggled to mask. Observers at court sometimes described the sweet and foul mingled air surrounding certain royal figures, a mix of rosewater, musk, and decay. Physicians of the time relied on the theory of humors. They prescribed bleeding, purging, or herbal tonics to rebalance the body. But without germ theory, they did not address the underlying hygiene issues causing many of these illnesses. Symbolism versus reality. It is striking that even as diseases ravaged their bodies, royal women continued to perform the rituals of beauty and purity. A queen with decaying teeth still smiled regally at court. A princess with skin sores still wore powdered wigs and painted her cheeks bright red. Hygiene-related disease was seen as unfortunate, but it did not disrupt the performance of power. Attendants played a key role in maintaining the illusion. They replaced stained linens, applied thicker layers of makeup, and perfumed rooms to disguise smells. The royal image had to remain untarnished, even if the body beneath was suffering. Medical secrecy and court politics. Royal illness was often treated as a state secret. A queen's appearance affected diplomatic relations, marriage prospects, and national morale. As a result, skin diseases, tooth loss, or foul odors were carefully hidden from public view. Only a small circle of physicians and trusted ladies-in-waiting knew the true extent of their conditions. This secrecy sometimes had political consequences. Rumors about a queen's failing health could spread through foreign courts, weakening alliances. Conversely, some rulers exaggerated their queen's beauty and vitality to project strength. Hygiene, disease, and politics were intertwined in complex ways. royal women lived at the intersection of luxury, neglect, and expectation. They were expected to embody purity and perfection, even as their hygiene practices led to chronic illness and disfigurement. Beneath the jewels and gowns, their bodies bore the hidden cost of royal beauty: rotting teeth, scarred skin, parasites, and pain.
The royal bathroom that wasn't. When people imagine queens and princesses of the past, they often picture glittering ballrooms, golden carriages, and elegant baths filled with rose petals. The truth, however, is far less glamorous. In most royal palaces of medieval and early modern Europe, there were no real bathrooms, at least not in the way we understand them today. Hygiene for royal women often meant navigating a complicated world of chamber pots, perfumed cloths, and public rituals that left much to be desired. Chamber pots in palaces. Royal women did not use toilets. Instead, they relied on chamber pots, which were small containers, often made of porcelain, brass, or even silver, kept near their beds or dressing areas. These pots were used for urination and defecation, sometimes several times a day, then emptied by servants. While the pots were often beautifully decorated, their contents were anything but. In large palaces like Versailles or Hampton Court, hundreds of nobles lived together, each using chamber pots. Servants carried these through corridors to dump into cesspits or nearby rivers. The smell often lingered in hallways, seeping through the palace despite attempts to mask it with herbs and perfumes. Royal women had attendants, known as ladies of the bedchamber or groom of the stool in some courts, who assisted them during these private moments. Privacy was minimal. In France, for example, the Queen's morning toilette was a semi-public ritual where nobles observed her dressing and washing routines. Even chamber pot use could happen in the presence of a few close attendants. What we consider deeply private today was, for royal women, a structured and almost ceremonial affair. Washing without water. Bathing was rare. Royal women went weeks without full-body baths, partly due to medical beliefs that water could weaken the body or allow miasms to enter the skin. Instead, they relied on partial washing with linen cloths soaked in scented water, vinegar, or wine. A typical wash might involve wiping the face, hands, neck, and underarms with perfumed cloths, then changing into fresh linen. However, these cloths were not always freshly washed, and the water could be reused several times for different people, including attendants. This method removed some surface dirt, but did not clean the skin deeply. Sweat, oils, and powders accumulated, especially under heavy gowns and corsets. Over time, layers of grime built up, giving rise to rashes, odors, and skin infections. Royal bath chambers, luxury versus use. Some palaces did contain elaborate bath chambers, with marble tubs, decorated tiles, and even running water in rare cases. But these were often status symbols more than practical spaces. Royal women might bathe a few times a year, often before major ceremonies like coronations or weddings. These baths were treated as special events, sometimes accompanied by musicians, scented oils, and attendants fanning the air. For daily life, however, the bath chamber remained largely unused. Physicians often advised against frequent bathing, claiming it opened the pores to disease. Ironically, this belief contributed to the very conditions, lice, sores, and illness that plagued royal courts. Toilet rituals and scent. Because chamber pots were emptied by servants and bathrooms were almost non-existent, palaces often smelled terrible. Visitors to Versailles wrote about the perfumed rot of the corridors, a mix of human waste, sweat, and strong floral scents.
Royal women tried to combat this with perfumed sachets tucked into their gowns, wigs, and petticoats. They sprinkled floors with herbs like lavender or rosemary and burned incense in their rooms. Some even carried small pomanders, decorative balls filled with spices or vinegar-soaked sponges to hold to their noses in foul-smelling spaces. However, these methods masked rather than solved the problem. Waste still accumulated in courtyards and cesspits. During hot summers, the stench became unbearable. In some palaces, human waste seeped through the walls and vermin thrived. Nighttime hygiene. At night, chamber pots were placed beside the bed, sometimes inside elaborate wooden boxes with padded lids. Attendants might cover them with scented cloths to reduce the smell. In winter, these pots could freeze over. In summer, they festered. Royal women often wore night shifts, long linen garments to sleep, which were rarely changed daily. Combined with unwashed bedding and months-old wigs or makeup, nighttime was far from hygienic. Symbolism versus reality. It's crucial to understand that for royal women, hygiene was not about cleanliness, but about appearances and ritual. Using a beautifully crafted chamber pot in a gilded bedroom, wiping with perfumed cloths, and bathing only on grand occasions fit perfectly into the royal image of luxury, even if the reality smelled terrible. The contrast between luxurious objects like golden pots, perfumed linens, and marble tubs, and disgusting habits like rare washing, public toileting, and lingering waste is one of the most striking aspects of royal hygiene history. Behind every glittering throne room was a hidden network of servants dealing with chamber pots, dirty linens, and unwashed bodies. Royal women lived in worlds designed to project power and perfection, but their most intimate hygiene practices were primitive, uncomfortable, and often foul-smelling. The royal bathroom was not a sanctuary of cleanliness. It was a place where status and filth coexisted in strange harmony.
Unwashed gowns, heavy corsets, and wig infestations. Royal fashion dazzled the world. Portraits of queens and princesses from European courts show women draped in silk, velvet, lace, and jewels, wearing elaborate wigs and impossibly tight corsets. But behind this elegant facade was a less glamorous truth. Their clothing was rarely washed, and the elaborate garments they wore often became breeding grounds for dirt, lice, and disease. The weight and complexity of royal clothing. A royal woman's outfit could weigh up to 30 kilograms, especially for court ceremonies. Multiple layers of linen shifts, petticoats, corsets, gowns, overskirts, and heavy trains were secured to the body with ribbons, pins, and stays. Dressing required several attendants and could take hours. Once dressed, these garments were not easily removed. Bathing or even partial undressing during the day was inconvenient. Many royal women wore the same linen undergarments for several days, sometimes weeks at a time. Their outer gowns, often made of delicate fabrics like silk or brocade, were rarely washed at all, since water could damage them. Instead, they were aired out, beaten with brushes, or sprinkled with perfume and herbs to mask odors. Corsets and skin problems. Tight corsets created the fashionable hourglass figure that symbolized noble femininity, but they also caused serious hygiene issues. The skin underneath was often damp with sweat, especially during summer or long ceremonies. Since bathing was infrequent, sweat mixed with powders and oils led to rashes, fungal infections, and sores. The stays and boning of corsets could rub against the skin, leaving bruises or open wounds. These wounds, trapped beneath layers of fabric, often became infected.
Some accounts from ladies-in-waiting describe the smell of decaying flesh beneath corsets that had not been removed for days. Medical advice of the time sometimes encouraged women to wear corsets tightly to support their organs, a belief that only worsened discomfort and hygiene problems. Wigs, a kingdom of lice. In many European courts, especially in France during the 17th and 18th centuries, wigs were a vital part of royal fashion. Noblewomen wore towering wigs powdered white and decorated with ribbons, feathers, and sometimes even miniature ships or gardens for special occasions. These wigs were rarely washed. Instead, they were dusted with starch powder, often scented with lavender or orange blossom. Unfortunately, they also became havens for lice and fleas. To combat infestations, women wore small scratching tools called lice sticks hidden in their hair or wigs so they could discreetly relieve the itching during social events. Servants sometimes baked wigs in ovens for a few minutes to kill insects, a risky process that occasionally set wigs on fire. At night, wigs were placed on stands, sometimes covered with cloth, but they were not cleaned regularly. Insects thrived in the powder and sweat embedded in the hairpieces. Visitors to Versailles noted the smell of wigs lined up in royal dressing rooms, a mix of perfume, powder, and decay. Linen and laundry limitations. Undergarments, shifts, and chemises were usually made of linen and did absorb sweat and dirt. These were washed more often than outer garments, but often, in the royal sense, meant once every few weeks, not daily. Laundry for hundreds of courtiers was a monumental task. Water had to be hauled, linens boiled, and drying took time. As a result, many royal women rotated between a limited number of undergarments, sometimes wearing slightly soiled ones if clean linen wasn't ready. Stains from menstrual blood, sweat, and bodily fluids were common, especially in the warm months when laundry services were overwhelmed. Perfume as a substitute for washing. Because clothes were not frequently washed, royal women relied heavily on perfume sachets sewn into their gowns. They carried pomanders filled with spices or vinegar-soaked sponges to counter unpleasant smells. Attendants sprinkled garments with rose water or lavender before court events. This created a strange sensory environment, rooms filled with both floral perfume and human odor, like trying to mask rot with flowers. Symbolism of clothing versus reality. Royal clothing was a display of wealth, power, and control. The heavier and more elaborate the dress, the more it showed that a woman did not have to work or move freely. However, the lack of hygiene behind these garments reveals a very different reality. Beneath the silks and jewels, many royal women suffered from itching, sores, lice, and unbearable heat. Fashion dictated their daily discomfort. What looked regal in portraits often smelled foul in real life. Court gossip frequently mentioned odors or infestations discreetly, as openly criticizing a queen's cleanliness could be dangerous. Attendants and hidden labor. Behind every royal woman was a small army of attendants responsible for dressing, undressing, brushing, perfuming, and maintaining her garments. These women handled soiled linens, powdered wigs, and smelly corsets, often exposing themselves to lice and infection. Their work kept the illusion alive that the queen was immaculate, when in fact the garments themselves carried layers of filth. Royal gowns, corsets, and wigs symbolized elegance and power, but their maintenance, or lack thereof, reveals a stark truth. Royal hygiene stopped at the surface. Beneath the glittering fabric, centuries of dirt, sweat, and lice thrived, hidden behind perfume and ritual.
Masks of purity. Public image versus private reality. From portraits and public ceremonies, royal women appeared as flawless beings, skin as white as porcelain, hair arranged in towering perfection, gowns glittering with gold. But behind palace doors, their personal hygiene habits told a very different story, one carefully hidden from the eyes of courtiers, diplomats, and subjects. The split between public image and private reality was one of the defining features of royal hygiene culture. This divide wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate construction of power, symbolism, and politics. The power of appearances. In medieval and early modern Europe, royalty was theater. Every gesture, outfit, and facial expression carried political meaning. For queens and princesses, their bodies represented dynasties. A spotless appearance meant a pure lineage. Pale skin meant privilege. Perfume meant refinement. Public events like coronations, audiences with ambassadors, and royal processions were carefully staged. Courtiers stood in awe as royal women floated through halls smelling of rosewater, their faces glowing under candlelight. To the public, this was proof of their divine right to rule. But behind palace doors, their personal hygiene habits told a very different story, one carefully hidden from the eyes of courtiers, diplomats, and subjects. Morning rituals, controlled intimacy. Every morning, royal women underwent toilet rituals, semi-public grooming ceremonies attended by select nobles and ladies-in-waiting. These rituals allowed them to perform cleanliness without actually practicing modern hygiene. They would wipe their faces with scented cloths, apply fresh layers of powder and perfume, change undergarments, sometimes, and don gowns with the attendance of attendants. The entire process was about spectacle, not sanitation. These carefully choreographed routines also created a sense of privilege. Only certain nobles were allowed to witness the queen in private, reinforcing their status at court. Yet even in these intimate moments, true bodily realities, odors, dirt, and discomfort were strategically hidden behind ritual. Secrecy around illness and smell. Odors were one of the biggest threats to royal image. A foul smell could spark gossip, undermine respect, and damage a queen's reputation. As a result, perfume became a tool of political survival. Servants constantly refreshed scents in rooms, burned incense, and carried sachets to disguise the smell of chamber pots, dirty clothing, or skin infections. Illnesses caused by poor hygiene, like skin diseases or tooth decay, were treated with secrecy. Medical consultations happened behind closed doors, and attendants swore oaths of silence. If word spread that a queen's skin was scarred or her breath was foul, it could be interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor or weakness, both politically dangerous. Attendants, the invisible keepers of royal reality. Behind every perfect royal image stood dozens of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, laundresses, hairdressers, and chambermaids worked tirelessly to manage the smells, dirt, and waste that came with royal life. They emptied chamber pots, scrubbed stained linens, applied cosmetics, styled wigs, and perfumed rooms. Their labor allowed royal women to maintain the illusion of immaculate cleanliness. But these attendants were often the only people who truly knew the physical realities beneath the silk and jewels. In some courts, gossip among servants spread stories of the queen's private habits, her smell, her sores, her dental issues. Such gossip could become powerful political ammunition if it reached the wrong ears. Portraits versus real life. Portraits and later engravings reinforced the public image. Royal women were depicted as goddesses, saints, or classical beauties. Artists smoothed skin, brightened eyes, and hid flaws. Portraits of figures like Marie Antoinette or Elizabeth I present timeless beauty,
But these are visual fictions. In reality, these women often smelled strongly of perfume mixed with sweat, their skin hidden under toxic lead paint, their gowns harboring weeks of grime. But the public saw only the portraits and performances, not the private chambers. Political necessity of the illusion. Maintaining this duality was not merely personal vanity, it was a political necessity. If subjects or foreign ambassadors saw the true physical state of royal women, it could damage the monarchy's image as divine, pure, and superior. Queens were expected to embody the nation's moral and physical health. A dirty or diseased queen symbolized a diseased kingdom. Thus, hiding hygiene habits wasn't just personal, it was an act of statecraft. Cracks in the mask. Sometimes, however, reality broke through. There were occasional whispers in foreign courts about a queen's unpleasant odor or strange appearance up close. Letters between ambassadors sometimes mentioned the difference between a queen's painted portrait and her physical presence. One Venetian ambassador at the English court in the 15th century described meeting Elizabeth I up close this way. Her face, painted white, cracks when she smiles. The air around her is sweet and yet heavy, as if to smother less noble scents. These rare glimpses behind the curtain remind us that royal women lived lives of contradiction, publicly angelic, privately human. Royal hygiene was a carefully managed delusion, not a reflection of true cleanliness. Underneath the wigs, gowns, and perfume lay real bodies with real problems, sweat, sores, and smells. Yet through ritual, secrecy, and spectacle, these women maintained an image powerful enough to command nations.
Royal births, luxury, ritual, and filth. Childbirth has always been a defining part of royal women's lives. Producing heirs was not just a personal or family matter, it was a political duty. Dynasties depended on the bodies of queens and princesses. But behind the ceremonial grandeur of royal births lay a world of poor hygiene, dangerous medical practices, and shocking postpartum rituals. The birthing chamber. When a royal woman was nearing childbirth, she was often moved into a specially prepared birthing chamber. These rooms were elaborately decorated with tapestries and curtains, their windows tightly closed to block bad air. Candles burned day and night, filling the room with heat and smoke. The air inside quickly became stale and suffocating, especially because physicians and attendants believed that fresh air could harm both mother and child. This belief, based on humoral medicine, led to rooms becoming hotbeds of bacteria and odor. Linen sheets and curtains, once hung, were rarely washed until after the birth, absorbing sweat, blood, and other fluids over days or weeks. Lack of hygiene during labor. During childbirth, royal women were surrounded by dozens of attendants, including midwives, physicians, noble witnesses, and ladies-in-waiting. In France and England, births were often public events in the sense that courtiers were allowed to witness or wait in adjoining rooms to verify the legitimacy of the heir. However, none of these observers practiced what we would consider hygiene. Hands were often unwashed or cleansed only with scented water or wine. Instruments, if used, were not sterilized. The birthing bed was often reused, covered with layers of linen, but rarely cleaned properly between deliveries. As a result, royal births were dangerous breeding grounds for infection. Many royal women and princesses developed fevers or postpartum infections, what later became known as childbed fever. Since germ theory didn't exist, these deaths were often blamed on fate, sin, or bad air, rather than the filthy conditions. Postpartum realities. After giving birth, a royal woman was expected to observe a period of lying in, often lasting several weeks. She remained in the same dark, stuffy birthing chamber, surrounded by heavy curtains, incense, and perfumed sachets to mask odors. She was typically not allowed to bathe during this period for fear that water would weaken her body. Blood-soaked linens were changed, but not always daily, and attendants wiped her body with scented cloths rather than washing. The result was persistent odors, infections, and discomfort. Visitors often remarked on the stifling atmosphere of royal lying-in rooms, where sweat, blood, and perfume mixed into a heavy scent. Some foreign diplomats found these practices barbaric, but dared not criticize them openly. Ceremony over cleanliness. Every stage of royal childbirth was wrapped in ceremony. Noble witnesses watched to ensure the child's legitimacy. Bells rang across cities when a male heir was born. Lavish christenings followed, sometimes just days after birth, even when the mother was still weak or infected. These ceremonies prioritized political spectacle over maternal health. Queens were expected to look composed and regal shortly after labor, even when suffering from fever or wounds. Perfume, makeup, and elaborate gowns were applied to create the illusion of strength. Wet nurses and infant hygiene. In many royal households, newborns were handed to wet nurses shortly after birth. Royal women rarely breastfed, as it was considered unfitting for their status. Wet nurses sometimes came from lower social classes, bringing their own hygiene practices, not always sanitary, into the royal nursery. Infants were swaddled tightly in unwashed cloths, and baths were rare. Herbal waters and powders were used instead. Infant mortality among royal children remained high well into the 18th century, partly because of these unhygienic practices. Historical examples. Queen Jane Seymour of England, Henry VIII's third wife, gave birth to Edward VI in 1537 in such unsanitary conditions that she died of childbed fever less than 2 weeks later. Marie Antoinette gave birth in 1778 in front of a crowd of courtiers, fainted from heat and lack of air, and spent weeks in a dark lying-in chamber surrounded by scented curtains. Many royal women across Europe suffered repeated infections or prolapses from multiple births without proper medical care. The politics of the royal womb. A royal woman's body was both sacred and public property. Her hygiene was controlled by court customs, physicians, and political expectations. She had little say in how her childbirth or recovery was managed. This lack of agency meant that unhygienic practices persisted for centuries, even as evidence of their dangers mounted. Ritual trumped reason. Appearance trumped comfort. Royal births may have been wrapped in gold in ceremony, but beneath the surface they were hot, airless, unsanitary ordeals that cost many women their health and lives. Perfume, curtains, and ritual could not hide the reality. The royal womb was a place where politics and filth collided.
Royal periods. Silence, secrecy, and stains behind the silk. Menstruation was a taboo subject in medieval and early modern European courts. Royal women were expected to embody purity and perfection, and that meant their menstrual cycles were rarely spoken of in public, even though they shaped court calendars, fertility expectations, and daily life. Behind layers of silk gowns and perfumed linens, queens and princesses endured their periods with primitive hygiene methods, secrecy, and ritual. Secrecy and silence. At court, menstruation was never discussed openly, not even among women. Menstrual blood was associated with impurity, weakness, or even danger in some medical beliefs of the time. Royal women were expected to maintain their composure and elegance even during painful cramps, heavy bleeding, or discomfort. Ladies-in-waiting and personal attendants were the only ones who knew the reality. They managed stained clothing, discreetly cleaned bedding, and prepared cloths for absorption. These tasks were done in utmost silence to protect the queen's image. Any sign of menstruation in public, a stain on a gown, a smell, or even a visible change in behavior could become the subject of court gossip. Since royal women symbolized divine purity, such gossip could be politically damaging. Cloth pads and improvised protection. Sanitary products as we know them today did not exist. Royal women typically used strips of linen or rags, folded and layered to absorb menstrual blood. These cloths were washed and reused, often by servants. Washing was not always thorough, and drying took place in indoor rooms, leading to musty smells. Some women stuffed cloths or wool into their undergarments. Others tied folded linen between their legs with ribbons. Leaks were common, especially during long court functions when women could not excuse themselves. Many wore dark-colored petticoats or multiple layers to hide stains. During heavy flow, attendants might change cloths several times a day, but privacy was limited. In large palaces, some women sometimes relied on chambermaids to bring fresh linen discreetly through side passages. No baths, only wipes. During menstruation, bathing was often discouraged by physicians, who believed water could open the body to illness. Instead, royal women wiped themselves with perfumed cloths, rose water, or vinegar-soaked rags. These methods masked odor, but did little for true cleanliness. Without frequent washing, dried blood and sweat accumulated, especially under corsets and multiple layers of gowns. In hot months, the smell could become noticeable, prompting even heavier use of perfume sachets. Menstruation and clothing. Royal gowns were complex and layered, making it difficult to change cloths or clean oneself quickly. Tight corsets, petticoats, and heavy skirts meant that menstrual management often required attendants to help undress or partially remove clothing, a process that could take 15 to 30 minutes. As a result, some women endured long court functions with soiled cloths or stains, hoping perfumes and layers would disguise everything. In rare cases, if a visible stain appeared during a public event, attendants would form a human shield around the queen or princess and quietly escort her away. Cultural and religious rituals. Menstruation was often tied to religious notions of purity. In Catholic courts, women were sometimes discouraged from taking communion while menstruating. Some royal women had private chapels where they withdrew during their periods to avoid being seen as ritually impure. Superstitions were widespread. Some physicians warned that menstrual blood was corrosive or could cause illness if exposed. Others claimed it could spoil wine or crops. These beliefs deepened the silence surrounding menstruation, forcing royal women to manage it in the shadows. Menstrual cycles as political timers. Despite the secrecy, menstruation played a political role. Courtiers tracked the queen's cycles closely, not publicly, but through attendants and physicians, to predict fertility, possible pregnancies, or infertility. A missed period could set off a chain of diplomatic whispers, as potential heirs were crucial for alliances and succession. Conversely, irregular cycles could spark rumors about health problems or aging, affecting a queen's influence at court. Stains and gossip. There are scattered historical records of menstrual stains becoming political gossip. Ambassadors sometimes mentioned seeing a queen leave abruptly from court functions or whispered about strange odors in chambers. Even if exaggerated, these stories show how menstruation, a natural process, was weaponized in the world of royal politics. In some courts, attendants were punished severely for allowing any sign of menstruation to become public. Cleanliness was less important than maintaining the illusion that royal bodies were pure and controlled.
Perfume over filth. Royal smells, teeth, and daily grooming.
When we imagine queens and princesses of the past, we often picture them as symbols of elegance, dressed in silk, surrounded by flowers, walking through perfumed halls. But the reality was far more pungent. Behind their glittering appearances, royal women often lived in environments filled with body odors, bad breath, and minimal hygiene routines. Perfume didn't just enhance beauty, it was used to mask the stench that permeated royal courts. Body odor beneath the layers. Royal women typically wore multiple layers of heavy clothing, linen chemises, corsets, petticoats, outer gowns, and embroidered overgarments. These were rarely washed, sometimes only a few times a year, because laundering expensive fabrics risked damaging them. Instead, undergarments soaked up sweat and were occasionally changed, but the elaborate outer layers trapped heat and moisture against the skin. Regular bathing was uncommon. In many European courts, especially from the 14th to 17th centuries, bathing was believed to open the pores and invite disease, so royal women wiped themselves with scented cloths, rosewater, or vinegar, but avoided full baths for weeks or even months. The result was persistent body odor, especially in warmer months or during long ceremonies. To counteract this, queens and noble women wore perfumed sachets hidden in their clothing, small bags filled with dried flowers, herbs, or spices. Some even sewed these sachets into corsets and sleeves to keep the fragrance close. Hair washing and scalp hygiene. Hair washing was similarly infrequent. Many royal women washed their hair only a few times a month, or even less. Instead, they sprinkled powders made of starch, crushed herbs, or ground flowers onto their hair to absorb oil and mask odor. Elaborate hairstyles, including towering wigs or tightly braided buns, were left intact for weeks. Combing was done to remove some dirt, but lice and nits were a constant problem. Some queens used fine-tooth combs soaked in vinegar or oils to reduce infestation, but total elimination was rare. Powdered wigs, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, trapped sweat and oils from the scalp. Perfumed powders temporarily freshened them, but after weeks, the combination of sweat, powder, and hair oils produced a rancid, sweet smell. Royal teeth, a painful reality. Royal women's smiles often hid decayed, discolored teeth and terrible breath. Toothbrushes existed in some forms, imported from the East, but their use was limited and inconsistent. More commonly, royal women rubbed their teeth with cloth dipped in vinegar, wine, or herbs. Some used tooth powders made from crushed shells, pumice, or charcoal, which often eroded enamel. Sugar consumption among the elite was extremely high, especially in Renaissance and Baroque courts, where sugar was a symbol of status. This led to widespread tooth decay. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for example, famously suffered from blackened, rotting teeth later in life. Dentistry, as we know it, didn't exist. Rotten teeth were pulled with crude tools, often without anesthesia. Abscesses and infections were common, and chronic tooth pain plagued many royal women. But despite this, they were expected to maintain composure and grace, even through constant discomfort. Bad breath and court etiquette. Bad breath, or halitosis, was so common among nobles that perfumed handkerchiefs became fashionable, not just as accessories, but as defensive tools. Courtiers would hold them near their faces during conversations to mask unpleasant smells. Royal women chewed cloves, cinnamon sticks, or herbs like mint to temporarily freshen their breath. Some rinsed with wine or vinegar. But since tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, these methods only covered odors briefly. Grooming rituals and symbolism. Daily grooming for royal women focused less on cleanliness and more on appearance and symbolism. A queen's body represented the dignity of the realm. so her visible presentation, powdered skin, elaborate dresses, perfumed hair, mattered more than actual hygiene. Servants and ladies-in-waiting assisted with dressing, combing, and perfuming. Hygiene rituals became theatrical acts, reinforcing status rather than promoting health. For example, applying scented oils to the skin instead of washing. Changing undergarments in the morning but leaving outer garments unchanged for weeks. Using jewelry and lace to distract from yellowed teeth or smells. The palace smell. Palaces themselves absorbed these scents. Without modern plumbing or regular washing, royal residences were often filled with layers of odor, human sweat, perfume, candles, chamber pots, animals, and unwashed fabrics. Travelers often described royal courts as simultaneously magnificent and overwhelming in smell. Perfume was the constant answer. Royal women wore it, burned it, carried it, and even sprayed it on furniture. But instead of creating a clean environment, this perfume with filth created heavy, cloying atmospheres.
Thrones without plumbing, the royal toilet habits you never knew. When people think of royal palaces, they imagine golden halls, sparkling chandeliers, and marble floors. But beneath this glitter lay a very different reality. Toilets were primitive, privacy was limited, and sanitation was shockingly poor. Royal women, despite their status, had to live within these unsanitary systems every day. The absence of modern toilets. For much of European history, royal palaces did not have modern flush toilets. Instead, royal women used a variety of alternatives: chamber pots, close stools, and in some cases simply secluded corners of their rooms. A close stool was essentially a wooden chair with a hole in the seat and a removable pot underneath. These pots were emptied by servants, often known as groom of the stool in England, but not always immediately. In many cases, chamber pots would sit in private chambers for hours, filling rooms with odors, especially in summer. Some palaces had garderobes, early versions of toilets built into walls, where waste dropped into pits or moats. But these were poorly ventilated, rarely cleaned, and often infested with insects. Royal women sometimes avoided them altogether due to the smell and fear of disease. No real privacy. Perhaps the most shocking element for modern readers is the lack of privacy. Royal women were rarely ever alone, even during toilet use. Ladies-in-waiting or personal attendants were always present, not only to assist with heavy clothing, but also to maintain protocol. Queens often sat on their close stools while attendants held up their skirts, handed them cloths for wiping, or simply waited in the room. In some courts, this act itself was a kind of ceremonial intimacy, where favored attendants gained status by being allowed to help the queen in private matters. In France, certain high-ranking courtiers even considered it an honor to stand nearby as the queen relieved herself, as a sign of trust and closeness. To outsiders, this might sound humiliating, but at court, it was a recognized part of hierarchy. Clothing complications. Royal gowns were notoriously complex, with corsets, petticoats, and multiple layers, making it very difficult for women to relieve themselves quickly or discreetly. Many royal women wore garments with hidden slits to allow them to urinate without fully undressing. Some carried small portable chamber pots under their skirts during long ceremonies or travel. In 18th century France, for example, noble women used bordeleus, small boat-shaped porcelain pots, which they placed between their legs to urinate while standing or slightly crouched, often behind a screen or even inside a carriage. After use, attendants discreetly carried the filled pot away. Leaks and spills were not uncommon, especially during crowded court events. Odors in the palace. The accumulation of chamber pots and poorly maintained garderobes created overpowering smells in royal residences. Versailles, one of the most magnificent palaces in Europe, was notorious for its sanitation problems.
Even though it housed kings and queens, hallways often smelled like urine and feces because courtiers relieved themselves behind curtains, staircases, or in unused rooms. Royal women's chambers were perfumed heavily with incense, rosewater, and scented sachets to mask these odors, but the underlying stench remained, especially in summer when waste pits overflowed or insects multiplied. Disposal of waste. The handling of human waste was the job of lower servants, and their work was neither prompt nor hygienic. Chamber pots were sometimes emptied into palace gardens, moats, or nearby rivers. In some cases, they were simply dumped out of windows, a practice that horrified foreign visitors. Royal women were often shielded from the disposal process, but the smells and consequences were unavoidable. Some historical records note that outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases were common in palaces due to these unsanitary methods. Menstrual waste and toilets. During menstruation, royal women disposed of soiled linen in special baskets or had attendants rinse them in private washrooms. These rooms were rarely well ventilated, adding to the general odor of living quarters. The combination of menstrual cloths, chamber pots, and limited cleaning created a persistent background smell in women's chambers that was disguised, not eliminated, by perfume. Toilet etiquette and ceremony. Using the toilet was not just a bodily function for queens, it was wrapped in etiquette and protocol. Who could enter the room? Who could hand the queen a cloth? Who could empty the pot? All of this reflected court hierarchy. In some courts, new attendants were trained on toilet duty as part of their initiation. Royal women had to maintain dignity even during these moments. They sat on their stools as if on thrones, composed and poised, surrounded by attendants. There was no question of privacy. Even basic functions were public performances of status. Royal toilets were not golden thrones. They were wooden chairs, chamber pots, and open pits, surrounded by attendants, smells, and ritual. Despite their power and luxury, royal women lived in worlds where sanitation was medieval, privacy was non-existent, and perfume was their only defense.
Poisoned beauty, cosmetics, skin rituals, and hidden filth. Royal women were expected to look flawless at all times. Their faces symbolized not only beauty, but also power, purity, and divine favor. To maintain this image, queens and princesses across Europe used elaborate cosmetic routines. But beneath the surface, these routines involved toxic substances, unhygienic practices, and skin-damaging habits that would horrify modern dermatologists. White skin as a status symbol. For centuries, pale, porcelain-like skin was considered the ultimate sign of nobility. It proved that a woman did not have to work outdoors and was therefore of high status. To achieve this look, royal women applied thick layers of white makeup, often made from lead carbonate or Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. This substance gave their faces a ghostly, smooth appearance, but it was highly poisonous. Repeated use caused the skin to crack, peel, and develop sores. Instead of stopping, women applied even more layers to cover the damage, creating a vicious cycle. Over time, this led to chronic lead poisoning, hair loss, blackened teeth, and, in some cases, death. Layer upon layer without washing. Royal women rarely washed their faces with water, believing it could damage delicate skin or open pores to illness. Instead, they wiped off the top layer of cosmetics with cloths soaked in rose water, vinegar, or milk, then immediately reapplied new makeup. This meant that old makeup, sweat, and dirt often remained trapped beneath new layers. Over weeks, this created thick coatings that clogged pores, attracted dust, and developed foul smells. Servants sometimes used blunt knives to scrape off hardened makeup before applying a fresh layer. Rouge and lip color. To bring color to their pale faces, royal women applied rouge made from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, crushed cochineal insects, or red lead. Mercury compounds in particular were extremely toxic. Prolonged use caused trembling hands, mood changes, and neurological problems. Though at the time, these symptoms were often attributed to melancholy or spiritual imbalance rather than cosmetics. Lip color was often made from plant dyes mixed with wax or animal fat. These mixtures spoiled quickly, especially in warm rooms, producing rancid odors. Yet they were applied daily without sterilization. Wigs, pomades, and skin contact. In the 17th and 18th centuries, royal women often wore large powdered wigs coated with pomades, greasy mixtures of animal fat and perfumes. These pomades were applied to both wigs and the scalp, making hair sticky and attracting insects. When these pomades touched the skin along the hairline, they often caused acne, infections, or rashes. Since hair was washed infrequently, the fat and powder accumulated, turning rancid over time. Blemishes and patches. Ironically, the cosmetics themselves caused blemishes and scars, but court fashion turned these imperfections into accessories. Royal women wore black silk patches cut into stars, hearts, or dots to cover pockmarks or sores. These patches were often reused without cleaning, sometimes sticking to infected wounds, worsening them. Courtiers even developed a secret language of patches, where the placement of a patch on the face could signal flirtation, political allegiance, or mood. Perfume as cover, not cleanser. The combination of lead-based makeup, rouge, animal fat, and rare washing meant that royal women's faces often carried a distinct smell. To mask it, they wore heavily perfumed powders, especially on wigs and upper garments. Perfume was not used sparingly. Rooms, clothing, and even furniture were doused in scent to cover the underlying odors of sweat, cosmetics, and decay. Nighttime rituals, or the lack thereof. Unlike modern skincare routines that emphasize cleansing at night, royal women often slept with their makeup on. Some might wipe away the outer layer, but thick lead-based foundation usually stayed overnight. Their bed linens, therefore, absorbed oils, powders, and toxins, and were not washed frequently. Pillowcases often turned grayish-white from makeup residue. Over time, these dirty linens could harbor bacteria and worsen skin infections, but cosmetic beauty standards outweighed hygiene concerns. The slow poisoning of royal beauty. Historical accounts describe queens and noblewomen with gray, wrinkled skin hidden beneath powder, trembling hands from mercury exposure, and foul breath from lead damage. Yet these cosmetic rituals persisted for centuries because beauty was inseparable from power. To appear pale and flawless meant to appear divine, no matter the cost to one's health or cleanliness. At the end of the day, royal cosmetics were less about self-care and more about masking reality. Behind the porcelain skin and rose-tinted lips lay toxic chemicals, dirty layers, and hidden infections. The elegance of royal portraits concealed the truth. Their beauty rituals were slowly poisoning them.
Royal bedrooms were often described as luxurious, filled with silk curtains, carved wooden beds, golden embroidery, and perfumed air. But beneath that glitter lay a nighttime reality crawling with insects, unwashed linens, and foul smells. The beds of queens and princesses were as much a stage for political display as they were sites of daily filth. Bedding fit for a queen, but rarely washed. Royal beds were typically enormous, often elevated on platforms, with heavy curtains draped around to keep out drafts and provide privacy. The mattresses were stuffed with feathers, straw, or wool, covered with linen sheets, silk spreads, and embroidered canopies. However, these expensive fabrics were rarely laundered. Washing such materials was risky and labor-intensive, and since water was thought to weaken the body, frequent cleaning of bedding was not prioritized. Sheets might be changed occasionally, but blankets and mattresses often went months or even years without thorough cleaning. As a result, royal beds absorbed sweat, makeup,
body oils, perfumes, menstrual stains, and even chamber pot accidents, creating perfect conditions for insects and bacteria to thrive. Lice and fleas, royal nighttime companions. Despite their wealth, royal women lived in close contact with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Palaces were infested with these pests because central heating, closed curtains, and animal presence, dogs, cats, falcons, created warm environments where bugs thrived. Lice infested both hair and bedding. Royal women powdered their wigs and hair with perfumed starches, which temporarily masked the problem but did not kill the insects. Linens were shaken out, beaten, and perfumed, but not boiled or disinfected, meaning lice and their eggs often remained. Fleas were a constant irritation. Queens and ladies used flea traps, small decorative boxes lined with cloth and scented with honey or blood to attract the insects at night. In the morning, these traps were often full, a reality even in the most opulent courts like Versailles and the Habsburg palaces. Bedbugs behind the silk. Bedbugs nested in the seams of mattresses, wooden bed frames, and curtain folds. Because royal beds were so large and elaborately constructed, complete cleaning was almost impossible. Servants might briefly air the mattress or sprinkle herbs between sheets, but infestations persisted for years. Historical diaries and letters mention queens waking up covered in bites, scratching beneath their wigs, or burning herbs at night to keep insects away. Some used vinegar, lavender, or wormwood sachets to repel bugs, but these were only partial solutions. Perfume versus odor. The combination of infrequent washing, body sweat, cosmetics, and insects created a distinct nighttime smell in royal chambers. To mask it, attendants perfumed beds daily with rosewater, ambergris, or incense. Curtains were scented, sheets were sprinkled with floral waters, and perfumes were burned in braziers at the foot of the bed. Rather than eliminating filth, this created a layered aroma, sweet perfumes mixed with stale sweat and insect musk. Visitors often remarked that royal bedrooms smelled rich but also thick, especially in summer when heat intensified everything. Sleeping in full attire. Royal women often didn't sleep in modern nightgowns or pajamas. Instead, they wore linen shifts, which doubled as undergarments that were not changed daily. Some even slept partially dressed, especially if attendants or courtiers were expected to enter the room early in the morning for ceremonial awakenings. Their hair, coated in pomades and powders, was often wrapped in cloth, but rarely washed before bed. Cosmetics frequently remained on their faces overnight, staining pillows and sheets. Ceremony in the bedchamber. For queens, the bedroom was not a private retreat, but a political space. In France, for example, the queen's morning routine, or lever, was a semi-public ceremony where courtiers were admitted to watch her awaken, wash, minimally, and dress. This meant that even their dirty sheets and insect-filled beds became part of royal theater. Attendants carefully folded and removed linens in the presence of noble spectators, maintaining the illusion of elegance while hiding the reality of filth. Nighttime health issues. The unsanitary conditions of royal beds contributed to various health problems. Skin rashes and bites from bedbugs and fleas, respiratory issues from perfumed powders and unventilated rooms, spread of lice between members of court and attendants, chronic itching and scalp infections from lack of proper washing. Yet these problems were so normalized that they were rarely recorded as unusual. In the royal bedchamber may have been decorated with silk and gold, but at night it became a breeding ground for insects, odors, and hidden dirt. Queens and princesses slept under embroidered canopies, not in clean luxury, but in perfumed filth shared with lice and bedbugs.
Public appearances, perfumed illusions in a stinking world. When royal women stepped into the public eye, they represented not just themselves, but entire dynasties. Every procession, feast, or royal entry was a political performance designed to project wealth, purity, and superiority. But beneath the layers of perfume and silk, their bodies carried the same filth, sweat, and odors that they lived with behind palace walls. Public events, the grand illusion. Royal women appeared at religious ceremonies, coronations, festivals, and public processions dressed in elaborate gowns that weighed dozens of kilograms. These dresses were constructed with multiple layers of wool, linen, silk, and sometimes metal embroidery. However, these layers were almost never cleaned. Outer garments might be brushed and perfumed, but inner linings, soaked with sweat from long events under the sun, were rarely washed. In summer, beneath corsets and petticoats, the heat became unbearable and the body produced heavy perspiration. Since bathing was infrequent, royal women relied on perfumes, powders, and cloth sachets of herbs sewn into their gowns to mask body odor. These sachets often contained dried lavender, cloves, rosemary, or even powdered musk. They created a powerful aroma cloud, but it mixed with unwashed sweat, producing a thick, cloying scent that contemporaries sometimes described as overwhelming. Cosmetic maintenance on the move. Cosmetics were essential to sustaining the illusion during long events. Ladies-in-waiting accompanied queens with small cosmetic boxes containing white lead powder, rouge, lip color, and scented oils. Public appearances could last for hours. Under the sun or candlelight, the lead paste cracked, rouge faded, and sweat ran down their powdered necks. Rather than wiping their faces, attendants simply added new layers, more lead, more rouge, more perfume. This created a patchwork of textures, crusted powder mixed with fresh sweat, which gradually turned grayish or streaky. But at a distance, the thick makeup reflected light and looked smooth, maintaining the royal facade. The stench of the court. When royal processions passed through towns, locals often remarked on the overpowering smell that arrived with the royal entourage. Hundreds of courtiers, guards, horses, and servants moved together, few of whom bathed regularly. The combined scents of unwashed bodies, horse manure, perfumed clothes, and stagnant air trapped under canopies created an intense olfactory experience. For royal women seated in carriages or litters, the problem was worse. Carriages were poorly ventilated, often lined with velvet and fabric that absorbed smells over years. Queens sometimes burned incense inside the carriage to mask the odor, but that only thickened the air further. Gowns as traps of filth. Royal dresses were not just decorative, they were filth traps. Heavy skirts dragged along city streets, which were full of mud, animal waste, and human excrement, as urban sanitation was minimal. The hems of gowns picked up all this filth, carrying it back into palaces. Since washing these costly gowns risked damage, they were shaken, brushed, and perfumed, not scrubbed. Over time, the inner linings became darkened and stiff with accumulated grime. Hand hygiene and gloves. Royal women rarely washed their hands during public events. Instead, they wore gloves made of leather or fine fabric, often perfumed with ambergris or civet. These gloves masked odors from the hands, but also absorbed sweat and dirt. In some courts, women rubbed their hands with scented vinegar before wearing gloves, believing it kept away disease. But in reality, the gloves became breeding grounds for bacteria, especially after hours of use in hot weather. Ceremonial restraints. At many public events, queens were expected to remain motionless for long periods, standing or sitting in rigid postures. Corsets restricted movement, while elaborate hairstyles, sometimes towering more than a foot high, made it difficult to adjust clothing. If they felt sweaty, itchy, or dirty, they had to endure silently, maintaining a serene expression. Historical letters from attendants describe how after ceremonies, royal women would peel off layers of clothing soaked with sweat, their faces streaked with makeup, and their hair damp beneath powdered wigs. Servants rushed to apply fresh perfume and powder before they were seen again in private chambers. Symbol versus reality. The contrast between the royal image and the physical reality was stark. To the public, queens appeared divine, glowing, perfumed, untouchable. But those closest to them, attendants, hairdressers, chambermaids, knew the truth of sweaty corsets, soiled skirts, cracking makeup, and perfume masking filth. The entire performance depended on distance and ritual. As long as commoners observed from afar, the illusion held. But if anyone came too close, the overwhelming smell and the physical state of garments told another story. Entrelink. Royal women in public were not paragons of hygiene, but masters of concealment. Perfume, powder, and ceremony transformed unwashed bodies into symbols of divine power. Beneath the layers of silk and scent, the reality was sticky, sweaty, and unclean, a royal illusion maintained at all costs. Feasts, fingers, and filth. Dining with royal women. When people imagine royal banquets, they think of glittering halls, golden goblets, and endless dishes of rich food. But behind the theatrical luxury of royal dining lay a deeply unhygienic reality. Royal women, despite their status, ate and dined in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Hygiene, both personal and environmental, was almost entirely overlooked. Lavish tables, dirty surroundings. Royal banquets were often held in vast halls, lit by torches and candles. Tables were covered with embroidered cloths, gold and silver dishes, and ornate cups. But the halls themselves were poorly ventilated, smoky from fires, and crowded with courtiers, servants, and animals. Dogs, cats, and sometimes falcons moved freely under the tables. The floor was typically strewn with rushes, straw-like plants, which were rarely changed. Guests and servants threw bones, food scraps, and even spit onto the floor during meals. These rushes soaked up wine, grease, and spit, becoming a breeding ground for vermin. Rats, mice, and insects were common dinner companions. Hand-washing, a ceremonial gesture. Before and after meals, royal women participated in hand-washing rituals, but these were largely symbolic. A servant would pour scented water over their fingers into a basin. There was no soap, and only the fingertips were usually rinsed. The idea was to refresh rather than clean. During meals, utensils were limited. Forks were rare in medieval and early modern Europe. Most people, including queens, ate with their hands, sometimes using a personal knife. Shared dishes were common. Everyone dipped their fingers into communal plates of sauces, meats, or stews. Royal women would wipe their greasy fingers on bread, napkins, or even their clothing, as frequent washing during the meal was considered rude. This meant that their rings, gloves, and undergarments often became coated with layers of food residue. Cosmetics and food, a messy combination. Because royal women wore thick layers of white lead makeup and rouge, eating posed unique problems. The stiff makeup around the mouth often cracked during chewing, and traces of food stuck to the edges of the painted lips. Observers sometimes commented that a queen's smile could reveal crumbling makeup mixed with sauce or grease. But lip colors made from vermilion, a mercury compound, sometimes bled into food, and the taste of lead and perfume could mix unpleasantly with roasted meat or fruit. But these side effects were considered less important than maintaining the fashionable painted look. Leftovers and contamination. After royal banquets, vast amounts of leftover food were distributed to servants, the poor, or kept for later. However, refrigeration did not exist, and food hygiene was primitive. Meats and sauces often sat out for hours before being stored in cool rooms. Contamination from dirty hands, dishes, and flies was common. Royal women frequently ate sweetmeats, fruits, and pastries between meals, brought to their chambers by attendants. These treats were kept uncovered, attracting insects. Sometimes, food stored in ornate boxes or cabinets developed mold, but as long as it was perfumed, it was still served. Dental hygiene, or lack thereof. Rich diets heavy in sugar and meat, combined with poor dental care, led to serious oral hygiene problems among royal women. Toothbrushes were rare. Some used cloths with vinegar or herbs to rub their teeth. Others chewed on aromatic twigs. Lead-based cosmetics and sweet wines also damaged enamel. By their 30s or 40s, many noblewomen suffered from blackened, rotting teeth and chronic bad breath. Yet during banquets, they were expected to smile gracefully and converse even as their teeth decayed. Table manners versus cleanliness. Royal dining emphasized etiquette over actual cleanliness. Queens and princesses were trained to eat delicately, avoid large bites, and maintain elegant posture. But elegance did not equal hygiene. Under the table, dogs licked dropped bones, servants wiped greasy dishes with cloths instead of washing them thoroughly. Goblets were shared and rarely sterilized. Perfumed napkins were sometimes used to dab the mouth, but these napkins were reused repeatedly, rarely laundered. Post-meal routines. After meals, royal women participated in ritualized hand-washing again, followed by dabbing with perfumed cloths. Instead of brushing teeth, they might chew cloves or rinse with rose water to mask odors. The banquet hall floors, covered in waste and rushes, were swept infrequently, often only after several meals, allowing layers of food rot to accumulate. Health consequences. These unhygienic dining habits contributed to foodborne illnesses from contaminated leftovers, dental diseases from sugar and lack of proper cleaning, parasites and rats thriving in banquet halls, spread of germs through shared dishes and poor hand hygiene. Yet because everyone, from peasants to royals, lived in similar conditions, these problems were normalized. The difference was only in the gold and silk covering the grime. Royal banquets dazzled the eyes with their wealth, but behind the spectacle was a reality of filthy rushes, unwashed hands, rotting food, and decaying teeth. Royal women performed elegance at the table, but hygiene remained a distant concept, masked by perfume and ritual, not practice.
Royal secrets, menstrual hygiene behind the curtain. Throughout history, menstruation among royal women was treated as a private, even taboo subject, cloaked in secrecy and ritual. Yet their menstrual hygiene practices were often shockingly inadequate, even by the standards of their time. In a world with limited bathing, poor sanitation, and heavy clothing, managing menstruation was both a logistical and hygienic challenge for queens and princesses. Taboo and silence. In many European courts, menstruation was not openly discussed, even among women. Royal etiquette manuals and medical treatises spoke in vague terms like monthly purgations or female flux. The prevailing belief was that menstrual blood was impure or even dangerous, capable of spoiling food, wilting flowers, or sickening men. Because of these beliefs, menstrual hygiene practices were shrouded in silence and shame. Royal women were expected to continue their public duties, even during menstruation, while hiding any sign of it at all costs. This meant improvising with the materials available, often with unhygienic results. Cloth pads and rags. The most common menstrual product used by royal women was reusable cloth, often made from linen or wool. These cloths were folded and tucked between the legs or pinned to undergarments. Unlike modern sanitary pads, there was no waterproof layer, so leaks were common. These cloths were washed and reused repeatedly, but not with hot water or disinfectants. They were typically rinsed in cold water and sometimes perfumed to mask odor. In winter, drying took days in damp castles, allowing bacteria to thrive. Some accounts mention that blood-stained cloths were stored for reuse, creating unsanitary conditions. Free bleeding and layered clothing. In certain royal households, especially during earlier medieval periods, some women did not use absorbent cloths at all. Instead, they relied on the many layers of clothing they wore daily, long linen shifts, petticoats, and gowns to absorb menstrual flow. Since bathing was rare, these garments were not changed frequently, leading to weeks of accumulated stains and odor. Servants often added herbal sachets or perfumes to undergarments to mask smells, but they did not prevent leakage or bacterial growth. Perfume over cleanliness. As with other aspects of hygiene, perfume played a central role in menstrual management. Herbal sachets containing lavender, cloves, or rose petals were tied near the waist or sewn into clothing to mask menstrual odors. Rather than changing cloths frequently, royal women often changed or layered perfumes, believing that sweet scents could disguise any bodily smells. However, in warm weather or during physical activity, the mixture of menstrual blood, unwashed linen, and perfume produced a pungent odor that attendants often notice but never mention publicly. Limited bathing and infection risks. Because many royal women bathed infrequently, menstruation posed significant health risks. Physicians of the time often discouraged bathing during menstruation, claiming it could open the pores to harmful air or weaken the body. As a result, some women went entire cycles without washing their genitals properly. Combined with reused cloths and damp garments, this led to skin irritation, rashes, and infections which went untreated or were masked with more perfume. Disposal and secrecy. In most royal courts, menstrual cloths were washed by trusted female attendants in secluded areas. Disposal was handled with extreme discretion to avoid shame. Some cloths were hidden in chests until the cycle ended, then washed all at once. There were even superstitions that burning menstrual cloths brought bad luck, so they were stored rather than destroyed. This created unhygienic storage conditions inside palace rooms. Public duties during periods. Royal women were expected to attend banquets, ceremonies, and religious events even while menstruating.
This meant sitting for hours in tight corsets and layers of gowns while wearing makeshift cloth pads. Leaks were common. Attendants often stood nearby with cloaks or cushions to discreetly cover stains on chairs. Because menstruation was taboo, these accidents were rarely recorded in official documents, but private letters and attendants' diaries occasionally mention unpleasant odors or the need for urgent linen changes. Medical misunderstanding. Physicians often interpreted menstrual irregularities through superstition or humorism, the ancient theory of body fluids. They prescribed bizarre remedies, from bleeding in other body parts to applying poultices. Rather than encouraging cleanliness, some royal women even believed that menstrual blood contained toxins that should not be interrupted by frequent washing or changing of clothes, further discouraging hygiene. Royal menstrual hygiene was a hidden, unspoken world of rags, perfume, and silence. Behind the golden thrones and silk gowns, queens and princesses endured their cycles with inadequate protection, limited washing, and strong cultural taboos. The result was uncomfortable, unhygienic, and often unhealthy. A royal reality very far from the graceful image they were forced to maintain.
Birthing chambers, blood, ritual, and the unseen filth of royal childbirth. Childbirth among royal women was both a public event and a private ordeal. A queen's body carried not only personal hopes, but the future of dynasties. When royal women gave birth, palaces transformed into ceremonial spaces, filled with attendants, courtiers, midwives, and physicians. But behind the rituals, childbirth hygiene was dangerously inadequate, often leading to deadly infections and long-term health problems. The birthing room, closed, dark, and airless. When a royal woman went into labor, she was moved to a specially prepared lying-in chamber. Windows were shuttered, heavy curtains drawn, and fires lit, even in warm weather. The goal was to keep the air warm and still, as physicians believed drafts carried disease. This created stifling, airless rooms filled with the smells of sweat, blood, and burning herbs. Dozens of people, midwives, noble ladies, attendants, priests, and sometimes courtiers crowded into the space. Few washed their hands, and sterile tools were unheard of. In France and England, childbirth was often semi-public for queens. Witnesses were required to ensure the legitimacy of the heir. That meant multiple people stood near the bed throughout labor, watching and breathing in the same unventilated air. Midwives and unwashed hands. Midwives were skilled, but worked in a pre-germ theory world. They wore no gloves, often moving from one woman's birth to another without proper washing. Hands were often rinsed in rose water or vinegar for scent, not for sterilization. This practice led to postpartum infections, or puerperal fever, which killed countless women, including royals. Historical records show many queens dying not during childbirth itself, but days later from fever, caused by bacteria introduced during labor. Birthing positions and dirty linens. Royal women typically gave birth lying on their backs in grand beds draped with silk and velvet. Beneath them were layers of cloth, straw, and sheets meant to absorb fluids. These were rarely replaced during labor, even though births could last many hours. Blood, amniotic fluid, and other bodily matter soaked the bedding. Servants might add new layers on top, but they did not remove the old ones. The bed became a warm, moist environment, ideal for bacterial growth. After the birth, these sheets were often stored or washed days later, sometimes by lower servants rather than specialized cleaners. ritual over cleanliness. Childbirth was surrounded by rituals, burning herbs to purify the air, chanting prayers, or placing religious icons near the bed. But practical hygiene measures were minimal. Physicians focused on balancing humors rather than sterilizing tools. In some courts, knives or scissors used to cut the umbilical cord were wiped on cloth or dipped in wine, not boiled or disinfected. Linen bindings for the cord were reused. These practices introduced infections to both mother and child. Postpartum practices, the lying-in period. After childbirth, royal women entered a lying-in period of several weeks, during which they stayed in darkened rooms away from fresh air. Bathing was discouraged, as physicians believed it weakened the body and made women susceptible to illness. Royal mothers often did not wash their bodies fully for weeks, instead changing linens occasionally and relying on perfumes and herbs to mask odors. Vaginal bleeding continued for days, lochia, soaking undergarments and sheets, which were changed infrequently. Servants and attendants handled these linens discreetly, often rinsing them in cold water and drying them slowly, which did little to sanitize them. Infection and mortality. The combination of crowded rooms, dirty hands, contaminated tools, and lack of washing made royal childbirth extremely dangerous. Many queens and princesses died shortly after giving birth due to puerperal fever. For example, Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, died days after giving birth to Edward VI, likely from infection. Or Maria Luisa of Spain died of puerperal fever after her 14th childbirth. Countless lesser-known noblewomen faced similar fates. Baby care and wet nurses. Newborn royal babies were often handed to wet nurses shortly after birth. These women breastfed multiple children, moving between households. Hygiene standards were low. They rarely washed their breasts or hands between feeds. Newborns were swaddled tightly in unwashed cloths, their umbilical cords tied with reused bindings. The combination of poor hygiene and lack of medical knowledge made infant mortality high, even among royal families. Ceremonial cleanup. Days after childbirth, there was usually a public thanksgiving or churching ceremony, where the queen appeared in public again. Before this, attendants changed her linens, perfumed the room, and dressed her in clean gowns. But this was often the first thorough cleaning since the birth. By then, infections might have already set in, and the once grand birthing chamber had become a stagnant, filthy space soaked with weeks-old stains. And content. Behind the royal spectacle of childbirth lay a brutal reality. Dark rooms, dirty hands, unwashed linens, and a high risk of deadly infections. Queens and princesses gave birth surrounded by luxury, but the hygiene standards were medieval. Perfume, ritual, and ceremony masked the smell of blood and sickness.
On the road, royal women and the stench of travel. For royal women, travel was not just movement from one place to another. It was a grand display of power and prestige. Whether it was a pilgrimage, diplomatic visit, marriage procession, or seasonal relocation to summer palaces, these journeys were elaborate, slow, and crowded. But beneath the glittering carriages and royal escorts lay a world of filth, sweat, and improvised hygiene. Royal carriages, rolling chambers of odor. Royal women usually traveled in enclosed carriages lined with velvet, silk, and fine wood. These carriages were symbols of luxury, decorated with gold paint, tassels, and family crests. But in reality, they were stuffy, unventilated boxes that trapped every odor inside. Roads were rough, journeys were long.
Carriages could take hours or days to move between royal residences. Inside, queens sat in their heavy gowns, corsets, wigs, and layers of makeup, all of which intensified body heat and sweating. There were no fans, no open windows in winter, and rarely any privacy. The fabric interiors absorbed sweat, perfume, stale air, and bodily odors over years of use. Rarely were these interiors cleaned properly. Perfume and incense burners were used inside to mask smells, but this only made the air thicker and more suffocating. Bathroom breaks, an awkward reality. One of the least glamorous parts of royal travel was relieving oneself. There were no rest stops or proper toilets on the road. Royal women carried portable chamber pots, often made of silver or pewter, inside their carriages. Attendants would hold up cloaks or curtains while the queen or princess used the pot in motion. Spillage was not uncommon on rough roads. The contents were later emptied by servants, sometimes at roadside stops, sometimes discreetly tossed from the carriage. For longer journeys, temporary tents or closets were set up at designated stops. These were simple wooden chairs with holes and pots underneath, with little to no cleaning between uses. Changing clothes on the road. Traveling in full court attire for days meant no proper bathing or changing. Royal women sometimes carried a single linen shift to change into at night in roadside lodgings, but these shifts were rarely washed mid-journey. Powdered wigs and elaborate hairstyles were not removed during travel. If a journey lasted several days, attendants merely repowdered the hair, added fresh perfume, and pinned back loose strands. Dirt, lice, and fleas accumulated beneath the wigs. Gowns were brushed and perfumed at rest stops, but not washed. If rain or mud splattered the hems, servants wiped them down superficially. By the end of a long trip, royal attire was often stiff with layers of dust, sweat, and perfume. Temporary lodgings, a mix of luxury and filth. During long journeys, royal women stayed in monasteries, noble estates, or roadside palaces. While these offered beds and meals, hygiene was often poor. Linens might not be freshly washed, lice-infested mattresses were common, and chamber pots overflowed in guest rooms. Royal attendants would hang scented cloths, light incense, and sprinkle rosewater to cleanse rooms, but there was no real disinfection. Bugs hidden in wooden furniture and straw mattresses frequently spread between hosts and royal guests. Sea voyages, seasickness, and sanitation. For diplomatic marriages or pilgrimages, royal women sometimes traveled by ship. Sea voyages were slow, uncomfortable, and notoriously unsanitary. Cabins were cramped, airless, and filled with people, animals, and food stores. There were no bathrooms. Chamber pots were used below deck and often simply dumped overboard. Seasickness added another layer of filth. Buckets were placed in corners for vomiting, rarely emptied promptly. Changing clothes or washing was almost impossible on rough seas. Perfume and herbs were used to mask the combined smells of sweat, vomit, damp wood, and chamber pots. Perfume as travel shield. Throughout these journeys, perfume was the royal woman's strongest weapon against odor. Attendants carried sachets of herbs, pomanders, scented balls, and bottles of rosewater. Queens dabbed perfume on gloves, veils, and handkerchiefs, pressing them to their noses when the stench became overwhelming. But perfume did not eliminate the filth, it layered over it, creating a distinctive travel scent, a mix of musk, sweat, horse manure, damp velvet, and flowers. Health risks on the road. The lack of proper sanitation during travel often led to urinary tract infections from holding urine for long periods, skin rashes from wearing unwashed, tight clothing for days, lice and fleas spreading between carriages, inns, and ships, respiratory illnesses from stale air inside carriages and cabins. For royal women, these were accepted hazards of travel, endured silently behind the mask of elegance. Royal travel was a spectacle of wealth on the outside, but inside the carriages and ships, it was a hot, unwashed, perfumed mess. Queens and princesses journeyed across kingdoms not in cleanliness, but in layered filth, wrapped in velvet and gold.
Powdered faces and poisoned skin, the unseen filth behind royal beauty. In the courts of Europe, royal women were often celebrated for their elegance, pale complexions, and elaborate makeup. Their faces appeared smooth, flawless, and aristocratic, a living portrait of power. But behind that perfect facade lay toxic ingredients, unhygienic routines, and painful consequences that were rarely spoken about in public. The obsession with pale skin. Throughout much of European history, pale skin symbolized nobility. A woman with fair, unblemished skin was considered wealthy enough to avoid outdoor labor. Royal women went to extreme lengths to achieve this look, even if it meant damaging their health. To whiten their faces, queens and noble women used Venetian cerus, a white lead-based makeup that gave a smooth, ghostly complexion. It was made by soaking lead in vinegar, then grinding it into a powder and mixing it with water or oils to create a paste. This cosmetic contained toxic lead, which slowly absorbed through the skin. Women applied it daily, layering it thickly over their faces, necks, and chests, often without properly washing the skin beforehand. Layer upon layer, never truly cleaned. Royal women rarely removed their makeup fully. Bathing was infrequent, and water was often thought to cause illness. At night, instead of washing, attendants would wipe the face gently with cloth soaked in rose water or vinegar, leaving residues of makeup behind. Each morning, a new layer of white paint was applied over the previous day's mixture of sweat, oil, dust, and lead paste. Over time, the skin underneath could not breathe. Pores clogged, causing acne, rashes, and sores, which were then covered with even more makeup. Some women wore their makeup continuously for weeks, especially during festivals or diplomatic visits. Removing all of it would have required harsh scrubbing, which could damage already irritated skin. Rouge and lip colors from toxic to unhygienic. To add color to their ghostly faces, royal women used rouge made from cinnabar, or mercury sulfide, or crushed cochineal insects. These were applied with brushes, fingers, or sponges that were rarely cleaned. Lip colors were often mixed with animal fats, beeswax, or crushed flowers. Stored in small pots, these mixtures spoiled easily, growing mold or attracting insects. But attendants continued using the same containers for months, sometimes years, without proper hygiene. Beauty patches to hide skin damage. Lead-based cosmetics eventually caused skin lesions, scars, and discoloration. To cover these, royal women used beauty patches, small pieces of black silk or velvet cut into hearts, stars, or circles. These patches were glued over sores or blemishes using saliva, gum, or wax. It became fashionable to place these patches strategically on the face, but beneath the stylish appearance, they were literally covering infected wounds. Wigs and powder, a haven for filth. Cosmetics were not limited to the face. Royal women often wore elaborate wigs dusted with white powder made from starch or ground gypsum. These wigs were styled high, decorated with feathers, ribbons, or even miniature ships and gardens during the 18th century. Wigs were rarely washed. Instead, attendants repowdered them every few days, adding layers over hair already stiff with oil, pomade, and dust. The powder would mix with sweat and scalp oils, creating a dense, caked mass. This environment became a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and even mice, which sometimes nested inside especially large wigs. Some noble women scratched their scalps with long ivory sticks because direct touching was impossible.
the scent of rotting beauty. All these cosmetic layers, lead paste, rouge, animal fats, powders, combined to create a distinctive smell. Perfumes and scented gloves were essential to mask it. Rooms where royal women dressed were filled with clouds of powder and scent, coating the furniture and walls. By evening, after hours of sweating under layers of makeup and wigs, the mixture on their faces often began to crack and flake, leaving streaks and uneven patches. Yet rather than cleaning it off, attendants would simply dab more powder or paint on top, keeping the illusion alive. Health consequences. The long-term consequences of these cosmetic habits were severe. Lead poisoning caused hair loss, blackened teeth, paralysis, and even death. Mercury and rouge led to trembling hands, mood swings, and skin damage. Constant clogging of pores resulted in chronic infections. The weight of wigs sometimes caused neck pain and headaches, while lice infestations spread diseases. Historical accounts described royal women fainting during ceremonies, suffering mysterious illnesses, or developing severe skin conditions, all while appearing flawless in public portraits. The ritual of removal, occasionally. On rare occasions, usually after weeks, cosmetics were fully removed. Attendants used cloth soaked in wine, vinegar, or milk to gently rub away layers. This was not for hygiene, but to prepare for a fresh base the next day. The process often left the skin raw, irritated, and burning, especially around open sores.